Well, good day, everybody, and thank you for being here. My name is John Dernbach. I direct the Environmental Law and Sustainability Center at Widener University Commonwealth Law School in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Welcome to the Distinguished Environmental Speaker Series. This is the 11th year of our speaker series. We've made a point of inviting highly qualified speakers from a variety of backgrounds and perspectives. We've also made a point of giving our speakers the opportunity to reach beyond the academy and out into the broader community. Today's speaker is Professor Patrick Parento. He is professor of law and senior counsel in the Environmental Advocacy Clinic at Vermont Law School. He previously served as director of the school's Environmental Law Center and was the founding director of its Environment and Natural Resources Law Clinic. Professor Parento has an extensive background in environmental and natural resources law. His previous positions include Vice President for Conservation with the National Wildlife Federation in Washington, D.C., Regional Counsel to the New England Regional Office of the EPA, Commissioner of the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation, and he has also served as of counsel with Perkins Coie Law Firm in Portland, Oregon. Professor Parento has been involved in drafting, litigating, administering, teaching, and writing about environmental law and policy for more than 4 decades. His current focus is on confronting the twin challenges of climate disruption and biodiversity conservation through his teaching, writing, public speaking, and advocacy. On a personal note, I've known Professor Parento since the summer of 1977, which actually is beginning to seem like a long time ago, when I was a summer legal intern at the National Wildlife Federation in Washington, D.C. We also started work last summer on an article concerning remedies in climate change litigation. His presentation today is Rising from the Ashes, the Resurgence of Environmentalism. One administrative announcement before we begin. For those who want CLE credit for this program, please see the link to the evaluation form that will be put on the chat feature toward the end of the program. You must fill out the evaluation to get credit. So please welcome Professor Pat Parento.
Thanks very much, John, and hello, Harrisburg. It's nice to see you remotely. We still have winter here in Vermont. I don't know what you have down there in the southern belt. We've had about 2 feet of snow at our place in Thetford, Vermont for the balance of the winter. And it's just now started to seriously melt and the streams are rising. And pretty soon the hatches will be coming and all of us eager fly fishers will be out on the water in pursuit of the wild brook trout. But today we're going to be talking about 50 years of environmental law and policy in the United States. And I'm sure I don't look it, but actually that 50 years tracks my legal career. So that's pretty much when I graduated from Creighton University Law School, right on the cusp of the environmental movement. And I have been involved in that work for that period of time. So I'm going to share with you a PowerPoint presentation. This is a blast from the past, and I'm going to race through about 20 slides that sort of pick out some of the high points or low points, if you will, of the last 50 years of environmental law. And then I'm going to pivot to the next 50 and talk about what we're facing now and basically for the balance of not only my lifetime, but yours as well, and future generations. So without further ado, here is the PowerPoint. Rising from the ashes, just like the phoenix. Everybody see that, I hope? If you can't, somebody should tell me. And so we go 50 years back. There's an interesting portrait, right? You've got William Ruckelshaus, I guess it would be on my left, and Russell Train. With the Honorable Richard Nixon signing into law the Clean Water Act, 1972. the first two administrators of the Environmental Protection Agency. And of course, Nixon, as everybody knows, signed more environmental legislation than any president. You have to think about where we've been. And this is a scene from the 40s and 50s in Los Angeles when smog was so bad that people had not only a hard time breathing and triggering asthma attacks, but literally a hard time seeing where they were going. And all kinds of illnesses related to poor air quality. LA Basin is better. It's still not pristine by any means, but it's certainly a lot better. And this is what ushered in the Clean Air Act of 1970, which pretty much launched, along, of course, with NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, the modern era of federal environmental law. And then, of course, you can all recognize this familiar scene from the Cuyahoga River outside Cleveland. This is actually oil spills on the water igniting. That happened actually quite frequently back in the 60s. And a lot of people talk about the river spontaneously catching fire from the pollution, but that's a little bit of an exaggeration. It was obviously oil spills and oil slicks on the water that caused the inferno. We also had all these incidents of massive fish kills. This one, Lake Apopka in Florida, was famous for its massive fish kills. This one, 20 million to 30 million fish in one incident. We still have fish kills, of course. In fact, nutrient pollution is the single most significant cause of impairment in the waters of the United States today. And blue-green algae is a problem everywhere, including in our beloved Lake Champlain in Vermont. You might recognize this photo. This is the famous Love Canal, Niagara Falls, New York. Hooker Chemical thought it was a good idea to bury all the drums of waste in this pit, and then the city thought it was a good idea to zone this for residential development, and there was a couple of schools in here, and for many, many years, the problems lay hidden until they bubbled up to the surface, triggering Lois Gibbs and her campaign to clean up the Hooker site. This is what gave us Superfund. This, along with this is the Valley of the Drums, the famous scene from Kentucky. The industry used to think it was a good idea to just find an empty field and put their abandoned hazardous waste barrels in those locations. Those of us that were around in Jimmy Carter's lame duck session remember that when we went to the Hill to lobby, we said, well, there must be about 10,000 of these sites, Congress. We ought to be able to create a large enough fund of money. We thought $1 billion would do it. Well, it didn't. There isn't 10,000 hazardous waste sites. There's closer to 100,000. They're not all national priority list sites, but they all have contamination from a variety of causes. This is another historic event. This is the Santa Barbara oil platform blowout off of Southern California, another impetus for Congress to get serious about federal environmental legislation. And then, of course, we had the Exxon Valdez spill in Prince William Sound, Alaska, which caused such devastation. It actually destroyed an entire fishery permanently. It's never come back. And of course, we have all these kinds of scenes of oil slicked otters and other critters from oil spills. Fast forward to the infamous Deepwater Horizon explosion in the Gulf of Mexico and all the damage that it did. Oil spills are a reality of life. They're chronic. They happen sporadically, unpredictably sometimes. Other times, perhaps more predictable than not. But they're a part of life. But this is what led to the passage of the Oil Pollution Act. Actually, Exxon Valdez did, and then some amendments to the OPA after Deepwater Horizon. Here's another famous scene from the Adirondacks up here in northeast part of the United States. This is damage from acid deposition, acid rain, acid snowfall, and of course it damaged not only forests but alpine lakes where some of our favorite trout normally used to exist. Coming back, acid rain program has been largely a success, dealing with the SO2, sulfur dioxide catalyst of acid rain, not so much nitrogen oxides. Those are still a big problem. And the lakes haven't fully come back, but they're definitely on their way. Then, of course, we had the infamous discovery of the, quote, hole in the ozone. It's actually the thinning of the ozone layer that protects the Earth from ultraviolet radiation. And this led to the passage of the Montreal Protocol in 1987, and of course the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act implementing the protocol. It's one of the major success stories It's probably the most successful international multilateral environmental treaty on the books. And it's also a testament to the power of science, at least at that time. It was the findings of Molina and Rowland that really triggered the international communities coming together to deal with the ozone layer problem. The layer is healing. The scientists say it won't fully heal for perhaps the balance of the century, certainly many decades, but it's definitely a success story. We also have had some success banning some of the most toxic forms of chemicals. EPA has banned 9 chemicals total under the Toxic Substances Control Act, DDT, of course, one of the early ones, PCBs, lead out of gasoline, lead out of paint, lead out of pipes. Of course, we still have an awful lot of leaded pipes, a lot of potential Flint, Michigan contamination situations. Asbestos was banned in 1989. The Fifth Circuit overturned part of EPA's ban, so there are some limited applications of asbestos, but it's pretty much been banned from large commercial use. One thing in common that all of these various chemicals have is that all of the makers of these chemicals have eventually been found guilty of torts and assessed major damages for the impacts of their products. You might keep that in mind as we move into the modern era of dealing with climate change and the now 17 lawsuits against the major oil companies in the world seeking damages for their product, which is fossil fuels. The Endangered Species Act, of course, we had a lot of successes with restoration of the bald eagle and the peregrine falcon and the brown pelican and the gray whale and so forth. The ESA's primary contribution is basically stabilizing and preventing the extinction of species. 99% of the listed species are still extant in the world and still have a chance of recovery. The rate of recovery, of course, is a problem because it hasn't been nearly as robust as Congress and a lot of us lobbying for passage of the Endangered Species Act thought it would do. And of course, the threats to biodiversity are much, much greater than anything one statute, let alone the ESA that as it's currently implemented could do. It's no match for climate change, for example. But nevertheless, some successes under the Endangered Species Act. These days, we're dealing with, we banned whaling pretty much. Japan still does some whaling, but mostly whaling's been completely eliminated. But we have these problems now with the right whale, the most critically endangered whale in the world, off the Atlantic coast. There's maybe 350 whales total. And it's strandings and gear entanglement and ship strikes that are the major causes of mortality. So we'll be dealing, with these Endangered Species Act problems, these endangered species, problems with the balance. One of the major accomplishments that I'm always reminded of whenever I get down in the dumps and feeling, depressed or discouraged is laws like this one. With the stroke of a pen, Jimmy Carter set aside over 100 million acres of some of the most pristine, magnificent wilderness on earth with the Alaska Native Lands Interest Law. And I was proud to be a major part of that campaign to bring sportsmen together to get that law passed over a lot of opposition from the oil and gas industry and others. But it is an example of what can happen at least a moment in time when you have the lineup in Congress and in the executive branch to do something really significant. The Coastal Barrier Act is another one we worked on at National Wildlife. We led the charge in National Wildlife Federation. This is a very interesting law because it basically just removed all forms of federal assistance from the development of these barrier islands, including, of course, federal flood insurance, but also all manner of other kinds of tax breaks and other kinds of federal incentives. Plus, it banned the Coast Guard from authorizing any causeways to connect these barrier islands to the mainland. And without that, they remain pristine. And now we know just how important these barrier islands are as our primary natural defense mechanisms to sea level rise, storm surge, and many other forms of assaults on our coastal areas. And of course, then we have the Antiquities Act, setting aside, again, millions and millions of acres in national monuments. Here you're looking at the controversial and famous Bears Ears Monument in Utah. This is one of the ones that he who shall not be named slashed by 80%. And our new president, Biden, Vice President Harris, have promised to restore this. Deb Haaland, the representative from New Mexico, looks like she is now going to be confirmed as the new Secretary of Interior, will be the first Native person, Native woman certainly, but first Native person to be the head of the Department of Interior. So it's going to be very interesting to see how she administers the public lands under her control. This is the famous Grand Staircase Escalante monument, another one that he who shall not be named slashed by 75%, and some of the most dramatic geologic features on Earth in the Grand Staircase. This one also will be the subject of the new administration's review and restoration of some of the boundaries of these areas. So now I'm going to pivot to today. So here we're looking at the coast of New Jersey after Superstorm Sandy and all the damage that it did. Here we're looking at Katrina and the flooding of the 9th Ward. Most of the 9th Ward has not been restored. The population of New Orleans is permanently reduced by over 100,000. One storm event, massive amounts of damage. And of course, the scientists are now telling us that every single extreme event has a human influence, has a human fingerprint. There's, for every 1 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature, there's 10% increase in humidity. That humidity stays and grows and builds and is ready for every storm event that comes through, whether that's rain, snow, sleet, or ice, just like we saw in Texas with the shutdown of the power systems in Texas. That's a climate change related extreme event. Doesn't matter whether it's hot or cold, it's still extreme weather. It's still affected by anthropogenic increases of emissions of greenhouse gases. And in fact, there's a growing scientific consensus that these extreme polar events, polar vortexes as they're called, are connected to the melting of the surface ice in the Arctic. And it has to do with the way the jet streams work and the troughs and the ridges that move weather patterns around the continent. And a lot of scientists led by Jennifer Francis have been doing extensive studies, replicated over and over again, making connections between the melting of the Arctic and extreme weather events like what occurred in Texas. And the climate scientists want 3 decades of data and analysis and replication before they will declare a trend and attribute it to human causes. It's called deriving the signal from the noise. So it takes a long time for the scientific community to come to consensus on these points. This is the ironically named community of Paradise, California, destroyed in a wildfire several years ago. The wildfires from last year in Northern California, Oregon, Colorado, throughout the West were the most damaging ever. These fires are burning hotter. They're moving faster. They are so powerful that the fires in California are destroying sequoias that are 1,000 years old and never seen anything like this. So the intensity of these climate-related events is definitely increasing. It's outstripping the ability of scientists to keep up with them. They'll go through all the peer review they need to go through to get the reports out. And by the time that process is finished, events that are happening in the real world have already overtaken the scientific analysis. It isn't just climate change, climate disruption, climate chaos, climate crisis, whatever your preferred term. It's all manner of global problems these days. This, of course, is the massive problem of plastics in the ocean. These are the most visible forms of plastic, obviously, but microplastics are also an increasing problem, and not just in the oceans, but in all manner of waters of the United States, the Great Lakes, and many other water bodies. We're also, of course, now on the era of the forever chemicals. Many of you may have seen the movie Dark Waters, portraying the litigation around Dow Chemical and others using a variety of PFOA, PFOA, and PFOS chemicals. There's about 1,000 chemicals related to that family of chemicals that are very persistent. That's why they're called forever. And they've been used in firefighting and Teflon, and they're ubiquitous in everyday products everywhere. And now there are lawsuits all over the place pursuing contamination of groundwater supplies from these chemicals. EPA is still trying to come up with water quality standards to deal with them. Many states, 6 states, have already adopted standards. My home state of Vermont, neighboring states of New Hampshire and Massachusetts, for example. So these are some of the emerging problems that we've seen. We are coming off of the worst 4 years in American history of the most hostile anti-environmental administration the United States has ever seen. And we know who that is, and we won't talk any more about that. We are now into a new era, and the Biden-Harris administration has made climate change a major focus, environmental justice a major focus, a complete transformative change of every sector of the economy, energy, transportation, agriculture, land conservation. It's a full body replacement, if you will. That's the promise, of course. That's not yet the reality. And there's a long way to go on that score. The administration has targeted 128 of the prior administrations, as Joe Biden likes to say, the former guy, environmental rules and policies for, quote, review and ultimately replacement. So far, the count is 20 of the rules and policies have already been reversed or overturned. 68 are targeted and in the process. 19 new rules, environmental protection rules, have been adopted. And this is just day 50 of the new administration. The people that the Biden administration is appointing, of course, familiar faces here, John Kerry and Gina McCarthy, John being the climate czar on the international front, and Gina being the climate czar on the domestic front, are just sort of the top of the pyramid. There's a massive number of new people coming into Washington. This administration is getting off to a very fast start. I know, and John knows, a large number of the people that are filling the key slots at EPA, the Interior, Energy, Forest Service, and so forth, Department of Interior. And so I would say we are going to see a very robust number of initiatives across the board: land management, oil and gas leasing, new regulations on power plants, greenhouse gas regulations on power plants, new fuel economy standards, methane regulations for both new and existing sources, methane flaring rules for oil and gas recovery on public lands, and so forth. A very robust environment for lawyers, full employment, we hope, for law student graduates of Widener and Vermont Law School. That's what we're in the business to do. This is the moment in time when lawyers are needed to design and implement the policies that are needed to confront these profound existential challenges that we're facing. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the resurgence part of this discussion. So I've been involved with environmental advocacy, and I, probably loosely speaking, academics. I'm a bit of an unusual academic. I'm really more of an activist practitioner than a true academic. John is the true academic, and his list of scholarship is proof of that. But in any event, I've been involved with this stuff for a very long time, and seen lots of ups and downs, lots of progress, but also lots of setbacks. We used to say, and it's still true, no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, no permanent victories, no permanent losses. And that's all still very true. Lots of big changes that I've seen. The biggest one is the bitter partisan divide. That's the biggest one. And that's the most depressing. There was not a single piece of environmental legislation I ever worked on that was not bipartisan. We never, ever went to the Hill and lobbied and argued and fought for environmental laws and just walked away from the table. We always reached deals, always. It was unacceptable to quit and say, we're not going to make any progress at all. We're not going to ever agree. We're not going to compromise. We may take half a loaf today and try to come back tomorrow for the other. But it was a very, very different time in America. Some of you remember it, some of you maybe don't. But for me, the most depressing thing that I've watched over my career is the loss of any kind of rational, serious, adult conversations about these surpassing, consequential environmental challenges. And they're not just environmental. They're justice challenges, they're racial justice challenges, they're economic challenges, they're national security challenges. They're serious challenges facing this country, serious economic challenges and opportunities facing this country. And the fact that we don't have a highly functioning national government is the single biggest impediment to making serious progress on these problems. The last major piece of environmental legislation was the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. We did have an update of the Toxic Substances Control Act, but that was not a major advance on these major environmental problems. It's a real indictment of the Congress of the United States and the executive branch that they have not been able to come to grips with even the most mundane questions of environmental law, like what does the term waters of the United States mean? The fact that we can't get a legislative solution to a problem that continues to bedevil practitioners, people in industry and in the economy, landowners. For 40 years now, we've been arguing about some of these things, and the fact that we can't come to some resolution, in my mind, is a serious impediment. Some other things that are different between then and now. In the earliest days, it very much was a white-dominated, elite-dominated movement. It was very much inside the Beltway kind of politics and policies. It was not racially diverse. It did not pay close attention to the impacts on communities that were affected by some of the policies that were being promoted. It did not look at things that we do look at now, like just transitions and leave no one behind. Those were not primary focus of those 70s and 80s kinds of environmental advocacy. They are now, and it's past time that they become more involved, more central to the way forward. But I am encouraged by things like this. I'm encouraged to see that polling from a variety of sources is showing stronger and stronger public support and public understanding of things like the climate crisis. And it is, in fact, in the truest form, a crisis, an emergency. And it is growing in bipartisan support for action, not necessarily agreement on exactly what actions, of course, but a growing sense of the American public that we really do need to get serious about addressing the problems of climate change and biodiversity extinction. That is another very high priority item when you do public polling. The problem, of course, with polling, there's lots of problems maybe, but the big problem with attitudes is that they don't translate into votes. Environmental issues have typically not been voting issues, or at least if they are, they're far down the ballot. And they're not salient in the terms of political science. They're becoming that perhaps, but they have yet to hit that top tier level issue. And people have not yet made the connection between the environmental challenges that we're facing, the economic challenges that people are facing in this country, the loss of jobs, the weakening of the middle class. They're not making the connection that the way forward for both improving the well-being and the job opportunities for people, as well as improving environmental conditions and dealing with the surpassing threat of climate change. They're not making these connections yet in the voting booth, but it's getting closer to that. So one of the bright spots, I think, is the fact that we are seeing signs, at least, of stronger public support. This slide is merely to indicate that the challenges that we face in dealing with climate change in particular are not technological. It's true, we do still need research and development on storage. We have rapidly improving superiority of batteries and deployment of batteries as storage devices. We have pumped hydro storage is the biggest right now storage mechanism in the electricity sector. But it's not for want of technologies that we aren't transitioning more rapidly from fossil fuels into a cleaner, greener, more cost-effective, more economic, better jobs, better, U.S. leadership in the world trade, and so forth. No, it's not technological. That's not the problem. We have all kinds of technologies ready to be deployed and scaled. Nor is it an economic problem. Study after study shows that the damage that climate change is doing year on year is enormous and growing ever more enormous. And that delay and waiting to deal with the requirements of emissions reduction as well as adaptation, because at this point in time, we've wasted 30 years in dealing with emissions reduction. We're still putting 40 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere every year globally, and all the other greenhouse gases that are even more potent, nitrous oxide, methane, and the fluorocarbons. So we're still loading the atmosphere with all of these chemicals. But it's not because we don't have technologies to make a serious dent. It's true that in the later stages of getting to net zero emissions of greenhouse gases, it's true that the further you go, the more expensive and difficult it's going to be. And some of these high energy industries, steel, cement, and others are going to be real tough to get down to net zero. And certainly substituting fuels for airplanes and other types of transportation are going to be very difficult to crack those problems. But we can be doing so much more with the technologies that we have. And this whole idea of electrifying the transportation system is real, and it's happening. And electrifying home heating. In New England, our biggest home heating costs there's still a lot of people on fuel and oil and gas. And so electrifying home heating and using electricity from renewable sources, not from fossil fuel sources, it's got to be one of the biggest advances that's going to be needed. And yes, it's going to cost a lot of money up front, a lot of capital investment, but it can be done. This is one of the new cool electric vehicles that are coming out. That's one that anybody might want to take a tour on. So we're seeing an awful lot of developments on emissions reduction, but the scientists are telling us that we've lost the opportunity to achieve a stable climate through emissions reduction only. The current scientific sort of thinking, I guess you'd say, consensus is we've already passed 1 degree Celsius in terms of anthropogenic warming, human warming measured from the pre-industrial revolution days, really going back into 1750. That's when sort of most people mark the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change uses 1850 as the benchmark. But whatever benchmark you use, our emissions of CO2 and these other greenhouse gases are now at the point where we're being able to measure a 1.1 degree Celsius increase in global average temperatures. Of course, that's not uniform across the globe. Some places are much warmer than that. The Arctic is warming 3 times faster than any other place on Earth, for example. And that's because of feedback loops and the loss of albedo effect and a lot of other conditions. So the point is, and frankly, with the buildup of these gases in the atmosphere and the delayed effect, the lag time effect that those gases have on temperature and extreme weather events, we may well be committed, and probably are committed, to increases already above the 1.5 degrees Celsius that many scientists, including, of course, James Hansen, the first scientist to blow the whistle on climate change in 1988, his 1988 Senate testimony, Many scientists believe that 1.5 is actually the dangerous threshold for substantial damage from climate change. And we've probably already baked enough into the climate system to hit that target. All of which is to say that even if we were to reach zero emissions sooner rather than later, we're still going to have to come up with technologies to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And this is a screenshot that shows you all the different ways in which to think about how that carbon removal is going to have to be undertaken. The optimum way to do it, obviously, is to use the natural systems of the Earth that have kept the Earth in an energy balance for millennia. We're the ones who've knocked the energy balance of the Earth out of whack. And we've done it not only through emissions, but through destruction of the natural systems, the forests, the blue carbon resources of mangrove swamps and seagrasses, the soils, the way in which we produce food and disturb soils and till soils and burn to grow crops. All of these things, the loss of wetlands, over 50% of the wetlands of the United States destroyed, for example. These are the natural systems that would sequester the carbon if left to their own devices. So restoring a lot of these natural systems, preserving the ones we have, primarily the tropical rainforests of the Amazon basin, for example, but really soils and forests and vegetation and wetlands everywhere. That should be one of the principal strategies of climate stabilization, because that also serves the other important goal of arresting this tremendous loss of biological diversity. And the connection between habitat and biodiversity and all of these strange sounding critters and organisms that are out there in the forest should be pretty evident now with the COVID-19 crisis. That's a zoonotic outbreak. That's an outbreak that occurs when the virus jumps from animals, whether they be domestic or wild, to humans. That's what happened with COVID-19. That's what happened with the earlier SARS. That's what happened with swine flu. That's what happened with the avian flu. And the scientists are telling us to expect more and more of these kinds of tremendous zoonotic outbreaks. We've lost over 2 million people to COVID-19 and counting from this one event. We hope these vaccines work, obviously. But this isn't the last of the COVID. And the connection is, one of the reasons we're seeing these outbreaks is we're destroying habitat, we're moving animals into closer proximity with humans, we're relying more and more on actually harvesting some of these wild critters, as well as these massive factory farms with animals in confinement. And so this problem of biodiversity conservation and major human health threats from zoonotic diseases should become clearer as time goes on. But even if we were able to maximize protection of natural systems, that's probably not going to be enough to achieve the kind of removal of carbon from the atmosphere that's going to be necessary to reach anything like a stable climate system on Earth. And that introduces all these really exotic technologies of direct air capture and solar radiation management and neutrifying the oceans with all kinds of iron fertilization and so forth. So the scientists now are engaged in a number of experiments, some of which are sanctioned, some of which are not, looking for very unproven, looking at new technologies to figure out how to draw down carbon from the atmosphere. From my reading and talking with some of these scientists, they caution to say that this is a 50-year proposition we're talking about. You're talking about, at this stage, experimentation. There'll have to be field experiments. Some of it's laboratory. There'll have to be field experiments. There'll be pilot scale. They'll have to go to commercial scale. They'll have to be studied for years. They'll have to be vetted in the literature. None of this stuff is on the horizon, none of it. This is all late century stage kinds of technologies in terms of if they prove out and if they can be scaled to the levels of deployment necessary. It's that kind of long time frame. So Where we are today is that the climate issue is the galvanizing force for environmental law and policy, and I would suggest economic policy as well, and trade policy, global economic policy. And it's clear that environmental justice and climate justice is at the center of this. That going forward, solutions that we come up with can no longer ignore the effects on those that are most vulnerable, the people that have suffered the most disproportionate impacts, not only from conventional air and water pollution, but the accelerating impacts of climate change and displacement. Climate refugees is not a term of art. Refugees refers to people displaced by violence, but it is an appropriate term in terms of the mounting number of people who will be forced to leave their homes, island nations, the low-lying nations of the world, the central American nations that are pouring into the United States. All of those numbers of displaced people are going to be growing. So this idea of coming up with policies to reduce emissions and standing up the kinds of adaptation mechanisms and resilience systems, as they're called, that will be necessary to deal with the inevitable, unavoidable impacts of climate, which we're already seeing and will see in greater intensity as years go by. This is all going to have to be done now with the idea of justice. What's a just approach to these transitions? Who deserves the help and the focus and the attention as these problems get more and more severe? If we don't deal with a lot of these problems in the places where people are being impacted, we can expect to see the kind of flood of displaced people we've seen from Syria and other places on Earth that have caused all kinds of political problems and security problems. And the military is all over this issue. They're well informed and understand. They call climate change a threat multiplier phenomenon. And it's a high priority. It's a higher priority than terrorism for the military. So finding ways to incorporate concepts of environmental justice, equity, fairness into our solutions is going to be a major focus of the work going forward. And the youth are leading a lot of this. It isn't just Greta Thunberg, although God bless her, she's done a lot. But it was the millennials, and now it's Gen Z. It's the youth movement of the world, not just the United States, all over the world, that's leading the charge on this, and good for them, because we need the energy and the enthusiasm and the pressure that these youth climate justice movement people are bringing to bear. And then, of course, we have the reality of our own justice system and the most conservative Supreme Court, certainly in my lifetime. And we have justices on the Supreme Court who are quite suspicious, sometimes with cause, sometimes questionable, on the assertion of an agency authority to deal with some of these transformative challenges of climate change. And so any kind of policies the Biden administration is thinking about, replacing the so-called Affordable Clean Energy Rule that the DC Circuit has recently struck down from he who shall not be named, replacing that rule with an aggressive greenhouse gas regulation of power plant emissions is going to have to go through these people. It's going to have to get 5 of these people to agree with whatever the Biden administration comes up with. And you can go right down the list of any other major kind of policy to address climate. When we're basing these policies on statutes that were enacted in the 1970s, before the real threat of climate disruption was understood, it was understood by some, even as early as then, but before it was certainly understood by people in Congress, they didn't draft these laws with that in mind. They drafted them to give the agency some discretion, some authority to respond to emerging science and emerging threats. But I don't have to tell you that conservative justices take a very dim view of agencies arrogating to themselves broad authority to impose expensive, quote unquote, major rules on the American people. So whatever happens under existing law is going to be subject to very close scrutiny by a very conservative Supreme Court. And that makes for a challenging uh, program for the Biden administration to achieve what it needs to achieve through existing law. So the next 50 years is the most consequential years in the history of the United States and the world, in my humble view. It is indeed, as the Chinese say, a crisis. Those are the characters for crisis in Chinese: dangerous, opportunity. This quote is attributed to Pogo. It's actually a fellow by the name of Bill Mollison. We are surrounded by insurmountable opportunities. They say it's not a technology problem, it's not an economy problem, it's a political problem. Here's why I am feeling more optimistic than normal, I suppose, or certainly in the last 4 years. I do think the public support for change is growing and strengthening. I am encouraged by the youth armies taking to the streets, coming to, the programs across the country, not just law schools, but engineering schools, business schools, all manner of higher education, learning what they need to learn to take over the reins of our government systems, our economic systems, and really seriously implement changes, transformative changes. We're done with trying to just deal with the symptoms of these problems. We need to go to the root, and the roots are always in the economic models that we follow. I'm encouraged to see that the environmental movement is now joined hand in hand, linking arms with the justice, the environmental justice, the social justice communities. I'm encouraged to see a multiracial coalition building to deal with these problems. We do need to deal with the urban-rural divide. That's a serious problem for achieving a consensus in terms of politics, in terms of votes, in terms of Congress moving forward. But it's also true at the state levels as well. And that divide is real, and it's serious, and it's going to require more attention. Communication and conversation, yes, but some kind of unification of common interests and some kind of, understanding that we do have not only a common enemy with climate disruption, but a common opportunity to deal with it in a way that everybody benefits. I'm encouraged to see that this is more of a grassroots, bottom-up approach. The world that I was used to was very much top-down federal. It's changed. It's very much state and local, and I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing there. I got to rush along here. There's a transformative changes occurring in every economic sector in the United States and all over the world. Not happening fast enough, but definitely happening. Green finance, the banks taking a harder look at their fossil fuel lending portfolios, doing stress testing, disclosing how their lending activities are either promoting or not clean energy. There's litigation on this around the world from shareholders forcing the banks to disclose and to divest from fossil fuels. That's a good sign that we're seeing. I think the just transition emphasis of the administration is exactly right. I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing in other countries, not yet in the United States, on the growth of the constitutional environmental law movement, the rights-based movement that underlie a lot of the climate litigation that's occurring. Voting rights is huge. Just imagine what Biden would not have been able to enact the COVID-19 relief bill. Whatever you think about that, I think it's a good piece of legislation. But whatever you think, he never could have got that without the Georgia votes and how close they were, and how now voter suppression has become such a major issue for the next election and then elections beyond. And of course, we have to understand that problems like climate is a global problem, that the United States can never solve it alone. But if the United States doesn't lead, if the United States doesn't make the kinds of commitments that are real and binding and verifiable, you can't expect China, you can't expect India, you can't expect Brazil, you can't expect some of the other major forces in this climate battle that we're facing to go along with us. So we're the ones that are going to have to get back in the leadership role. This is the climate clock. We don't have time to do it, but I put it up here for you. You can have this PowerPoint. I encourage you to take a look at it, put it on your desktop. This is counting down the hours and minutes and years that we have before we start crossing these critical thresholds, 1.5C, 2C, and beyond. Even if all the Paris commitments were met, we're still at 3C. So that's not going to cut it. And with a final slide here, this is a scene of the Himalayas 100 miles away. For the first time in 30 years, the entire range of the Himalayas, the roof of the world, as it's called, is visible for 100 miles. COVID is a terrible disease, a horrible pandemic. But one thing it did show us is this is what the world looks like without air pollution. This is the kind of world we could have if we were really, really serious about dealing with these problems. And with that, I best stop.
Well, Pat, thank you so much. That was really quite wonderful. It's very obvious that you brought to bear everything that you've known and done and thought about, and I'm really pleased that you were able to find time. What I'd like to do is open it up now for questions. I'm going to put the gallery view up, and if you use the hand signal function on, then I'll be able to identify folks that have questions. And this is like almost too big for me for the gallery function. So if somebody else has a question, anybody?
Stupefied.
There we go.
You can put it in the chat and I can read it if you want.
Yeah, I was looking for it in the chat. I don't see any comments in the chat yet. And I asked for it a while ago. Okay, Tamao, I see you've got your hand up.
Maybe on mute.
Tom, you're on mute.
You can't unmute. Okay, there, it's finally unmuted. I think the reason you don't see anything in chat is because the chat function's been disabled.
Oh, well, that's a problem. Okay.
But I'll raise a question in the meantime. And that is, you talked about connecting voters with environmental concerns to election issues. And I wonder that whether states which have a referendum process have a better experience in connecting environmental issues with voters and with outcomes.
Yeah, very good point. The referendum is interesting. What it shows, the ones that I've seen, like there was a referendum on a carbon tax in Washington state recently. And in the early days of referenda, when they do polling, they show very, very strong public support for such referenda. But then in the later stages, when the opponents to the referendum start pouring money in, particularly if they be wealthy economic interests, that overwhelms the public support and the referenda go down to defeat. Now in Colorado, interestingly enough, this is just an issue that I happen to follow just out of a personal interest because I love wolves. Colorado put a measure on the ballot to restore and reintroduce wolves into Colorado. If you think about Colorado, you will automatically realize there are a lot of ranchers in Colorado and a lot of cows, right? And they don't like wolves. But by golly, that's a referendum that actually passed. And I think that's an indication of this change that we're seeing, demographic change. Colorado is now a very purple state. And that's because of the urban-rural split. There's a much stronger urban, influence in the election there. That is not to say that you should just crush the rural opposition every time. I don't mean that. I just mean it does indicate that referenda can work, but they do have to deal with massive campaigns of publicity that can confuse voters and turn the tide.
So there's two questions in the chat, or at least, well, one is from Joe Della Penna. And again, Pat, in the old days, the people we got were from all within about 25 miles of Harrisburg. And now we're in Zoom world, we get a much broader audience, which is actually quite wonderful. And Joe asks, why do we continue to say climate change when climate disruption more accurately describes what is happening?
Yeah, you're right, Joe. You heard me switch back and forth. I still get myself confused. I'm one of those who was advocating we should drop climate change in favor of climate disruption. That's the term, by the way, that Obama's science advisor, John, help me, John.
Holdren?
Yeah, from Harvard uses. And I agree with you. It's much more about disruption than it is change. Change sounds like it could be good. And I guess in some cases you could probably argue that some form of global warming is good for some kinds of crop production. But the other thing is, some people call it climate chaos. That's not bad. And of course, Al Gore famously calls it global weirding, which is sort of another way of expressing it. We are searching for the right term to describe this phenomenon. That's for sure. But I agree, climate disruption is better than climate change.
So Jim May from our sister campus at Delaware has a question, and I think he's going to have to say it because I don't see the question in the chat. Jim?
Yeah, hi, John, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Pat.
Hey, Jim. Jimmy.
Great presentation. John, nice to hear you, see you. Okay, so Pat, two quick questions. And well, the first one, again, thanks, that was fantastic. Pat, question one is, what do you think the prospects are for climate legislation in the United States at the national and subnational level? I mean, do you see real margin for progress there? I mean, of course, potentially there is, but what do you think the real honest prospects are? Second question is, what's our, if you will, culpability in the climate crisis or climate disruption or whatever we're calling it as legal educators? The law has a role, rights-based approaches or statutory-based approaches have a role in addressing societal problems, including climate change. And did we come up short, or were best intentions just ignored? Thanks.
Yeah, I think there's real promise for infrastructure. I think there's going to have to be, the Biden administration is going to have to compromise not only with Republicans, but within the Democratic Party on which forms of infrastructure investment we're going to see. I don't know that we're going to see the $2 trillion that Biden would like to see, probably not. But I do think there's a moment in time where, renewables have proven themselves. The cost of solar is down by over 80%. Wind farms are producing more electricity in Texas than coal and nuclear combined. I really think there's an economic now case for scaling up renewables. And that's going to mean storage and transmission as well as generation. And so I think whatever's necessary for the United States to assert some leadership in deploying renewables, I think there's a real path forward for that, a bipartisan path forward. It's probably going to mean continued subsidies for nuclear because a lot of Republicans and some Democrats favor that. It's also probably going to mean investments in carbon capture and sequestration, which a lot of people are betting as a major climate strategy. I have serious doubts about CCS as a mechanism to prolong reliance on fossil fuels. It's cost prohibitive. It has not proven to be scalable at a commercial level at all. It would only work with massive government subsidies, and that's going to come at the cost of subsidies in places where we need it. The long story short, I do see investments in clean energy, clean transportation coming. I don't see carbon pricing coming, not anytime soon. I don't see major overhaul of the Clean Air Act to empower EPA to impose more stringent regulations on a lot of the facilities and categories of industry that need it. I hope I'm wrong about that, but right now I don't see that happening. The midterms elections are going to be critical. If the Republicans regain the House, obviously all bets are off. If the Democrats can not only hold the House, but maybe even expand they don't have a margin, they've got a deadfall in the Senate, but if they could take a stronger majority in the Senate, or if suddenly out of the blue we found new kinds of Republicans like those I used to work with, like John Chafee of Rhode Island, if they were to reemerge in the Republican Party, then you might have a chance of actually working across the aisles. On the second point, because I'm going on at length, the culpability of legal educators is a sensitive subject. Jimmy, how dare you suggest that we're not doing everything we should do? The truth is that a lot of us are wondering what the hell we are doing. We're teaching laws that are antiquated, outdated, outmoded, not working, not up to the challenges. You, Jimmy, and your colleague Aaron are charting new courses and arguing for stronger rights-based approaches. And obviously, our colleagues with Our Children's Trust are trying to make law through the courts recognizing a constitutional right to a climate system capable of supporting human life. You would think that would be a recognized fundamental right, wouldn't you? So I don't know whether we're doing enough. I don't think so. I'm beginning to think that money is the key and finance is the key. And this whole green finance, this whole complex of issues around banking and investment and shareholders, institutional shareholders having leverage. I'm thinking maybe we should be pivoting and looking more at how do we move the money out of fossil fuels and into greener technologies. How does that work? It's not conventional environmental law at all, but it might be something that we should be paying more attention to. Just some thoughts.
So we're at the 5 o'clock hour, and typically we want to try and wrap up a CLE program at that time. But I've just pulled a couple of questions out of there's a boatload of questions that appear in the chat now. One question is, could you recommend projects in which lawyers can participate to help draft environmental policies?
Yeah, buy John's book. John and Michael Gerard have done the work for you. They've got 1,000 policies, measures, instruments that and they're encouraging, John, you can talk about this. They're encouraging lawyers everywhere across the country to read the book and get involved. Lawyers need to really take responsibility for this moment in time. We're the ones that should be able to get on top of the science, on top of the technology, on top of the economic issues, and then start looking at laws, looking at the advice that we're giving. Obviously, we have loyalties to clients. I've represented private clients. I get it. But you still have an obligation and an opportunity to inform yourself about what opportunities there are, not just for clients you're representing, but also just in whatever way you can contribute through pro bono time, volunteer time. There's a tremendous amount of work to do, and it's good work, and it's interesting work, and you can feel really good about it, and you're doing something for your community and for the world. So there's tons of opportunities, and John can put you in touch with his website to find out more.
Yeah, I hadn't intended Pat to give me an ad, but I'm happy to take it. If you Google legal pathways to deep decarbonization, you should find the website. It's lpdd.org, legal pathways to deep decarbonization.org, lpdd.org. And there's a boatload of ways you can get involved in drafting, peer review, and all the rest, turning the recommendations in the book, and there were a great many recommendations in the book, into model laws. Another question here is, how important is it for local land use boards and health departments to take a more active role?
Oh, it's a critical role. Actually, one of the problems with climate change in the public mind, and unfortunately, it's probably people like me that have created it, is it's associated with polar bears floating on ice floes. It's a public health issue. And the more that people can understand the connection between climate disruption, climate change effects, you want to call them that, and public health and public security and public safety. Just think about this for a minute. If you look at what happened in Phoenix, Arizona last summer, they never went below 100 degrees for 17 consecutive days, day and night. It was so hot, planes couldn't take off. It was so hot, the asphalt on the runway was melting. That's just not going to be survivable if it keeps up like that. So just from the standpoint of looking at the urban heat island effect, right? And this is an adaptation question more than an emission reduction, but still, it's a climate question. If you just look at how are people going to survive as these temperatures, and the wet bulb temperature is the critical one that scientists talk about. And the answer is they're going to have to be cooling areas for people to go to, just like shelters from the storm. You're going to need to go to places to get cool. And people can't work outside all day long. They're going to have to change their hours. And it's going to have to be more refrigeration and more air conditioning. And that means more electricity. And where's that going to come from? And the green space in urban areas, trees, parks, roof gardens, all kinds, painting buildings white, literally painting roofs white. These are all climate health related issues. And one of the things about when you get people to focus on things like that, then they begin to make the connection to emission reduction. When you show them that the threats are being caused by this climate change phenomenon, and that's caused by emissions, and that this is what you're going to have to do to deal with it, to cope with it, then they start saying, well, wait a minute, we need to address more fundamentally the cause of all this. So making that connection between health and adaptation and reduction of emissions, that's critical.
So one last question, I couldn't resist. This is Seamus Clune says, "Hi Patrick from Ireland. This is our new global reach with courtesy of COVID. He thanks you for a great presentation. Then he asks, do you believe the tourism industry will change forever after COVID now that it is clear for the world to see how beneficial it is to the environment to reduce tourist flights? Will there be more control on the amount of recreational flight travel, and do you think there should be?"
I definitely think there should be. COVID has taught us that we can do a lot of this stuff the way we're doing it today. I wouldn't say that we should become exclusively virtual. I think human contact is still important. But I think this has shown us that we can reduce air travel miles dramatically. And frankly, academics, this is back to Jimmy's question, academics are some of the worst offenders. I don't fly around the country for a 10-minute presentation anymore. I used to do that. I used to go for 2 days and have 10 or 15 minutes on a panel. What's that about? No, we don't need to be doing that kind of stuff. And yes, we should still be able to fly and have vacations, but we should also be able to do a lot of our business, a lot of our personal interaction using the technologies that don't require carbon. Well, there is carbon in the cloud, so we can't completely avoid carbon even with internet kinds of exchanges, but we can certainly reduce air travel.
So with that, we'll bring the program to a close. I recognize fully, and Patrick certainly does too, that folks have other things to do with their time. Here on the East Coast, it's a beautiful day, and we appreciate your taking out the time to join us. Make sure, if you didn't see the form for your CLE, Joy Boudreau posted it a second time, so be sure you pick that up before we close. And what I will simply wish you all is have a great weekend. I should just say one last note I saw in the chat to give you one more sense of our global reach is that Kurt Juncker joined us today from Cologne, Germany. So we're just in a very different place in a post-COVID world. Thank you all very much. Have a great weekend.
Thanks. Be safe.